Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the May 2024 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of On the Dissolution of the Communist Party of the United States by Jacques Duclos from 1945, with an introductory note from Earl Browder. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So this piece is the next installment, as you may have guessed, in our anti-Browderism playlist that we've been doing for some time now. There's a link to that in the video description. And basically what we've covered up to this point in that playlist were some introductory texts, then what I call the Browder files, which basically show that one-time General Secretary of the CPUSA, Earl Browder, really knew his stuff in the 20s and 30s, and then something abruptly changed in the 1940s, at which point he started adopting all kinds of revisionist anti-Marxist lines. Revisionism in the Marxist context means the entry of bourgeois or capitalist ideology into the vanguard communist movement. As such, this playlist is also known as the First Wave USA Anti-Revisionist Playlist, or again, anti-Browderism for short, because it got named after Earl Browder. So after we got done with the texts by Browder, which demonstrated his about-face with regard to Marxist positions, we just covered a piece by William Z. Foster, who was actually kind of a centrist within the CPUSA, but he was kind of the face of the anti-Browderist opposition, which was later criticized, and we will cover this in phase 3 of this playlist, for basically not going far enough. That a lot of the same people who were criticizing Browderism were the same ones who, just a few years before, were supporting it. Some of that can be chalked up maybe to democratic centralism, but it was pretty enthusiastic. And even when the CPUSA got course-corrected, arguably it wasn't really enough. I thought that the last piece by William Z. Foster, The Letter to the National Committee, was very lukewarm. Well, anyway, here's another criticism of the Browderist positions, this time from a prominent French communist, Jacques Duclos. So we're going to begin with an introductory piece titled A Foreword to the Article of Jacques Duclos. This is by Earl Browder, editor-in-chief of The Daily Worker and president of the Communist Political Association, which is the organization which replaced the CPUSA for a time. This foreword is dated May 27, 1945. Let's begin. The Daily Worker is publishing herewith an extended article, just received, dealing with the position of America in its world relations, and some theoretical issues of Marxism raised by the policy pursued by the American communists. The author is one of the main leaders of the Communist Party of France, whose policy for its own country is unquestionably sound, and most recently registered pronounced success in the French municipal elections. Unquestionably, while this is the personal article of Jacques Duclos, it reflects the general trend of opinion of European Marxists in relation to America, and thus demands our most respectful consideration. Since the American communists severed their organizational connection with the Communist International in 1940, and especially since the Communist International was itself dissolved in 1943, there has been no institution through which American Marxists could counsel with the Marxists of all lands on the multitude of questions which are essentially international in character, whether these be theoretical problems or involving an estimate of the world relation of forces. Inevitably, under the new conditions, different judgments were made by the Marxists of different countries on some questions. Of this we are now presented with a very sharply expressed example in the article of Duclos. And commenting here, I think that both the CPUSA's exit from the Comintern and the disbanding of the Comintern were disasters. These were bad moves, and the official rationale given for the dissolution of the Comintern just doesn't really add up. But anyway, continuing, we are therefore faced with the necessity of conducting our discussions through the press, which, under the tradition of freedom of communication and the press, is our chief available substitute for organized consultation. Inadequate as it may be. We can only welcome the initiative of Jacques Duclos in utilizing this channel of international discussion. It has been clear at all times that the end of the war in Europe would require a fundamental review of all problems by American Marxists. We must estimate our past work and face the tasks of the future. We must make the most careful inventory, balance our political books, and know clearly how we stand as we enter a new period of sharpening struggles, crisis, and profound changes. The article of Duclos may conveniently provide a starting point for this fundamental review, which the CPA leadership had independently begun some time ago upon the basis of accumulating threats against the unity of the Great Coalition. The framework of this discussion is that it takes place within the Communist Political Association, as an autonomous American organization without affiliation with any other organization, and is conducted through its own established channels and according to its own rules. The CPA will make its own decisions after its own discussions, taking into account all available information and opinions that seem pertinent. Our enemies will raise a gleeful clamor to greet the open discussion of difference of opinion between communists of different lands and between communists within America. Some will shout that it marks the disintegration of the communists, others that it is the re-emergence of the Communist International, and all will use the occasion to heap slander upon us and spread as much confusion as possible. We have learned through years of experience to ignore such enemy attacks, knowing that the conclusion of our discussions is always a more solid unity of the communists. In this, we differ from the bourgeoisie. We recall, for example, the bitter exchange of polemics between the British and American press at the turn of the year, which ended not in a resolution of the deep cleavage thus revealed, but in covering it up again unresolved. Or the example of the deep split in the American bourgeoisie itself over Roosevelt's line of policy, a split that grows deeper the more it is discussed amongst them. Discussions among communists, on the contrary, always lead to clarity, to agreement, and to unity of purpose and action. Within the framework of the CPA organization, and according to its rules, the discussion initiated by the publication of Duclos' article will be free in the fullest sense. Members of the National Board and National Committee will participate in the discussion as individuals, and not as members of these leading bodies, bound to speak for common conclusions already reached before the broadest discussion. The National Committee will meet to draw conclusions after a period of discussion sufficient to crystallize the basic Marxist understanding of the CPA membership, and at that time undertake to focus this understanding into a clear perspective for the coming period of new storms. The National Board of the CPA, at its next meeting, which was to review some of the recent developments and the tasks which flow from them, will undoubtedly also give its evaluation of the main questions raised by Duclos. Results of the meeting will be published in the Daily Worker immediately upon its conclusion. All practical work now underway in the labor and progressive movement should continue along established lines. Let no one speculate on the conclusions of the discussion before they've been registered. Now is a testing time for the integrity, understanding, and maturity of the CPA and of each member. Alright, and that's the end of the introductory remarks by Earl Browder. Now let's get to On the Dissolution of the Communist Party of the United States by Jacques Duclos. This was published in Cahiers du Communisme, April 1945, and reprinted in William Z. Foster et al., Marxism-Leninism versus Revisionism. Many readers of Cahiers du Communisme have asked us for clarification on the dissolution of the Communist Party of the USA and the creation of the Communist Political Association. We have received some information on this very important political event, and thus we can, in full freedom, give our opinion on the political considerations which were advanced to justify the dissolution of the Communist Party. The reasons for dissolution of the Communist Party in the USA and for the, quote, new course in the activity of the American Communists are set forth in official documents of the party and in a certain number of speeches of its former secretary, Earl Browder. In his speech devoted to the results of the Tehran Conference and the political situation in the United States, delivered December 12, 1943 in Bridgeport and published in the Communist Magazine in January 1944, Earl Browder for the first time discussed the necessity of changing the course of the CPUSA. The Tehran Conference served as Browder's point of departure from which to develop his conceptions favorable to a change of course of the American Communist Party. However, while justly stressing the importance of the Tehran Conference for victory in the war against fascist Germany, Earl Browder drew from the conference decisions erroneous conclusions in no wise flowing from a Marxist analysis of the situation. Earl Browder made himself the protagonist of a false concept of the ways of social evolution in general, and in the first place, the social evolution of the United States. Earl Browder declared, in effect, that at Tehran, capitalism and socialism had begun to find the means of peaceful coexistence and collaboration in the framework of one and the same world. He added that the Tehran Accords regarding common policy similarly presupposed common efforts with a view to reducing to a minimum or completely suppressing methods of struggle and opposition of force to force in the solution of internal problems of each country. Quoting from that 1943 address at Bridgeport, that, the Tehran Declaration, is the only hope of a continuation of civilization in our time. That is why I can accept and support and believe in the Declaration at Tehran, and make it the starting point for all my thinking about the problems of our country and the world." Unquote. Starting from the decisions of the Tehran Conference, Earl Browder drew political conclusions regarding the problems of the world, and above all, the internal situation in the United States. Some of these conclusions claim that the principal problems of internal politics of the United States must in the future be solved exclusively by means of reforms, for the, quote, expectation of unlimited inner conflict threatens also the perspective of international unity held forth at Tehran, unquote. That's quoting from Tehran and America. The Tehran agreements mean to Earl Browder that the greatest part of Europe, west of the Soviet Union, will probably be reconstituted on a bourgeois democratic basis and not on a fascist capitalist or Soviet basis, quoting the Bridgeport speech again, but it will be a capitalist basis which is conditioned by the principle of complete democratic self-determination for each nation, allowing full expression within each nation of all progressive and constructive forces and setting up no obstacles to the development of democracy and social progress in accordance with the varying desires of the peoples. It means a perspective for Europe minimizing and to a great extent eliminating altogether the threat of civil war after the international war, unquote. And Earl Browder adds, in Tehran and America, quote, whatever may be the situation in other lands, in the United States, this means a perspective in the immediate post-war period of expanded production and employment and the strengthening of democracy within the framework of the present system, and not a perspective of the transition to socialism. We can set our goal as the realization of the Tehran policy, or we can set ourselves the task of pushing the United States immediately into socialism. Clearly, however, we cannot choose both. The first policy, with all its difficulties, is definitely within the realm of possible achievement. The second would be dubious indeed, especially when we remember that even the most progressive section of the labor movement is committed to capitalism, is not even as vaguely socialistic as the British Labour Party. Therefore, the policy for Marxists in the United States is to face with all its consequences the perspective of a capitalist post-war reconstruction in the United States, to evaluate all plans on that basis, and to collaborate actively with the most democratic and progressive majority in the country in a national unity sufficiently broad and effective to realize the policies of Tehran, unquote. To put the Tehran policy into practice, Earl Browder considers that it is necessary to reconstruct the entire political and social life of the United States. Quoting from the Bridgeport speech, every class, every group, every individual, every political party in America will have to readjust to this great issue embodied in that policy given to us by Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill. The country is only beginning to face it so far. Everyone must begin to draw the conclusion from it and adjust himself to the new world that is created by it. Old formulas and old prejudices are going to be of no use whatever to us as guides to find our way in this new world. We are going to have to draw together all men and all groups with the intelligence enough to see the overwhelming importance of this issue, to understand that upon its correct solution depends the fate of our country and the fate of civilization throughout the world. We shall have to be prepared to break with anyone who refuses to support and fight for the realization of the Tehran Agreement and the Anglo-Soviet American coalition. We must be prepared to give the hand of cooperation and fellowship to everyone who fights for the realization of this coalition. If J.P. Morgan supports this coalition and goes down the line for it, I, as a communist, am prepared to clasp his hand on that and join with him to realize it. Class divisions or political groupings have no significance now, except as they reflect one side or the other of this issue, unquote. Browder's remark regarding Morgan provoked quite violent objections from members of the American Communist Party. Explaining this idea to the plenary session of the Central Committee, Browder said, quoting from Tehran and America, I was not making a verbal abolition of class differences, but that I was rejecting the political slogan of class against class as our guide to political alignments in the next period. I spoke of Mr. Morgan symbolically as the representative of a class and not as an individual, in which capacity I know him not at all, unquote. Not really the issue, but As Browder indicates, creation of a vast national unity in the U.S. presupposes the communists would be a part of this. Thus, the communist organization must conclude a long-term alliance with far more important forces. From these considerations, Browder drew the conclusion that the communist organization in the U.S. should change its name, reject the word party, and take another name more exactly reflecting its role, a name more in conformity, according to him, with the political traditions of America. Earl Browder proposed to name the new organization the Communist Political Association, which, in the traditional American two-party system, will not intervene as a party, that is, it will not propose candidates in the elections, will neither enter the Democratic or Republican Party, but will work to assemble a broad progressive and democratic movement within all parties. In his report to the plenary session of the Central Committee of the CPUSA, Browder spoke in detail of the economic problems of U.S. post-war national economy, and their solution on the basis of collaboration and unity of different classes. Browder indicated that American businessmen, industrialists, financiers, and even reactionary organizations do not admit the possibility of a new economic crisis in the U.S. after the war. On the contrary, all think that U.S. national economy after the war can preserve and maintain the same level of production as during the war. However, the problem is in the difficulties of transition from wartime economic activity to peacetime production, and in the absorption by home and foreign markets of $90 billion in supplementary merchandise, which the American government is now buying for war needs. In this regard, Earl Browder claims that the Tehran Conference decisions make possible the overcoming of Anglo-American rivalry in the struggle for foreign outlets, and that the government of the United States, in agreement with its great allies, and with the participation of governments and interested states, can create a series of giant economic associations for the development of backward regions and war-devastated regions in Europe, Africa, Asia, and Latin America. As to the extension of the home market, to permit absorption of a part of the $90 billion worth of merchandise, Browder suggests doubling the purchasing power of the average consumer, notably by wage increases. Quote, Marxists will not help the reactionaries by opposing the slogan of free enterprise with any form of counter-slogan. If anyone wishes to describe the existing system of capitalism in the United States as, quote, free enterprise, that is all right with us, and we frankly declare that we are ready to cooperate in making this capitalism work effectively in the post-war period, with the least possible burdens upon the people, unquote. Further, Browder claims that national unity could no more be obtained by following a policy based on slogans aimed at the monopolies and big capital. Quote, Today, to speak seriously of drastic curbs on the monopoly capital, leading toward the breaking of its power and imposed upon monopoly capital against its will, is merely another form of proposing the immediate transition to socialism, unquote. In his closing speech to the plenary session of the Communist Party Central Committee in January 1944, Browder tried to base himself on, quote, theoretical arguments to justify the change of course of the American Communist Party. Also, he expressed his concept of Marxism and its application under present conditions. Browder thinks that by pronouncing the dissolution of the Communist Party and creating the CPA, the American communists are following a correct path, resolving problems which have no parallel in history and demonstrating how Marxist theory should be applied in practice. Quote, Marxism never was a series of dogmas and formulas. It was never a catalog of prohibitions listing the things we must not do, irrespective of new developments and new situations. It does not tell us that things cannot be done. It tells us how to do the things that have to be done, the things that history has posed as necessary and indispensable tasks. Marxism is a theory of deeds, not of don'ts. Marxism is therefore a positive, dynamic, creative force, and it is such a great social power precisely because, as a scientific outlook and method, it takes living realities as its starting point. It has always regarded the scientific knowledge of the past as a basis for meeting the new and unprecedented problems of the present and the future. And the largest problems today are new in a very basic sense. We have more than ever the task to refresh ourselves in the great tradition of Marxism, completely freeing ourselves from the last remnants of the dogmatic and schematic approach. True, according to all of the textbooks of the past, we are departing from orthodoxy, because none of our textbooks foresaw or predicted a long period of peaceful relations in the world before the general advent of socialism, unquote. The new political course outlined by Browder found but few adversaries among the leading militants of the CPUSA. At the enlarged session of the Political Bureau of the party, those who spoke up violently against Browder were William Foster, president of the CPUSA, and Darcy, member of the Central Committee and secretary of the Eastern Pennsylvania District. Foster expounded his differences with Browder in two documents, in a letter to the National Committee of the CPUSA and in his introductory speech to the Extraordinary Session of the National Committee, February 8, 1944. In these two documents, Foster criticizes Browder's theoretical theses regarding the change in the character of monopoly capital in the USA, the perspectives of post-war economic development, as well as Browder's position on the question of the presidential elections. In his February 8 speech, Foster also attacks those who, on the basis of Browder's theses, suggested that strikes be renounced in the post-war period. But in neither one of these documents did Foster openly take a stand against the dissolution of the Communist Party. Quoting from Foster's letter to members of the National Committee, in his report, Comrade Browder, in attempting to apply the Tehran decisions to the United States, drew a perspective of a smoothly working national unity, including the decisive sections of American finance capital, not only during the war but also in the post-war, a unity which, with him quoting approvingly from Victory and After, would lead to a, quote, rapid healing of the terrible wounds of the war, and would extend on indefinitely in an all-class peaceful collaboration for a, quote, long term of years. In this picture, American imperialism virtually disappears. There remains hardly a trace of the class struggle, and socialism plays practically no role whatever, unquote. Foster violently criticized Browder because the latter, while outlining a new course in the activity of the American Communist Party, had lost sight of several of the most fundamental principles of Marxism-Leninism. Quote, "It seems to me that Comrade Browder's rather rosy outlook for capitalism is based upon two errors. The first of these is an underestimation of the deepening of the crisis of world capitalism caused by the war. When questioned directly in Political Bureau discussion, Comrade Browder agreed that capitalism has been seriously weakened by the war, but his report would tend to give the opposite implication. The impression is left that capitalism has somehow been rejuvenated and is now entering into a new period of expansion and growth," unquote. According to Foster, world capitalism can surely count on a certain post-war boom, but it would be wrong to think that capitalism, even American capitalism, could maintain itself at the production level attained in wartime, and resolve in a measure more or less satisfactory to the working class the complex problems arising after the war. Without diminishing the importance of the Tehran Conference, Foster concluded nevertheless that it would be an extremely dangerous illusion to think that Tehran had in any way changed the class nature of capitalism, that the Tehran Conference had liquidated the class struggle, as it appears from Browder's speech. The fact that capitalism has learned to live in peace and in alliance with socialism is far from meaning that American monopoly capitalism has become progressive, and that it can henceforth be unreservedly included in national unity in the struggle for the realization of the Tehran Conference decisions. Quoting Foster again, "The class nature of imperialistic capitalism," Foster asserted, "is reactionary. That is why national unity with it is impossible. The furious attack of these circles against the democratic Roosevelt government, does this not supply a convincing proof? Can one doubt, after that the monopolist sections in the U.S. are enemies and not friends of the Tehran decisions, as Earl Browder thinks? The dagger in this whole point of view is that, in our eagerness to secure support for Tehran, we may walk into the trap of trying to cooperate with the enemies of Tehran, or even of falling under their influence. Trailing after the big bourgeoisie is the historic error of social democracy, and we must be vigilantly on guard against it," unquote. Foster also criticized Browder for his attitude toward the National Association of Manufacturers, which is, in his opinion, one of the most reactionary organizations of monopoly capital in the U.S. However, Browder thought he had to approve a certain number of the economic measures of this association. He accepts its central slogan, that of free private enterprise, which is in reality basically reactionary and contrary to the Roosevelt policy. What's more, Browder, counting on seeing workers' wages increased 100% after the war, invites U.S. monopolists to share his good intentions and says to them, quote, "You must find the solution in order to keep their plants in operation," unquote. Citing these words of Browder's, Foster declared, quote, "In my opinion, it would be a catastrophe for the labor movement if it accepted such a plan or such an idea, even if only provisionally. starting from a notoriously erroneous conception that U.S. monopoly capitalism can play a progressive role, Comrade Browder looks askance at all suggestions tending to subdue the monopolies, whereas the Communist Party can accept only one policy, that of tending to master these big capitalists now and after the war. In calling for the collaboration of classes, Browder sows wrong illusions of tailism in the minds of trade union members, whereas the job of the trade unions is to elaborate their policy and dictate it to the big employers, unquote. As to the problems of post-war organizations, Foster repudiated all illusions regarding the self-styled progressive role of monopoly capital. America, Foster declared, will emerge from the war as the powerful state in the world. The industrial magnates will be rather inclined to dictatorial acts than to compromises, and it is hardly likely, he added, that we can expect a progressive program from them. So, commenting here, what did we actually get? We got Taft-Hartley, which destroyed the labor movement, and the second Red Scare and McCarthyism. So yeah, definitely more the dictatorial acts. Anyway, quoting Foster, so far as the bulk of finance capital is concerned, starting out with a pre-war record of appeasement, it has, all through the war, followed a course of rank profiteering and often outright sabotage of both the domestic and foreign phases of the nation's war program, especially the former. While these elements obviously do not want the United States to lose the war, they are certainly very poor defenders of the policy of unconditional surrender. In the main, their idea of a satisfactory outcome of the war would be some sort of negotiated peace with German reactionary forces, and generally to achieve a situation that would put a wet blanket on all democratic governments in Europe, unquote. Foster thinks that Browder is right when he says that the question of socialism is not the issue of the present war, and that to pose this question now would only result in restricting the framework of national unity. But considering the fact that the successes of the USSR will increase the interest of the masses in socialism, the communists must explain to the workers the importance of the socialist development of our epoch, and the way in which it concerns the US, for otherwise the Social Democrats could represent themselves as a part of socialism. Quoting Foster again, the enforcement of the Tehran decisions, both in their national and international aspects, demands the broadest possible national unity, and in this national unity there must be workers, farmers, professionals, small businessmen, and all of the capitalist elements who will loyally support the program, unquote. Foster's letter to the National Committee and his speech at the extraordinary session of the National Committee on February 8, 1944, against Browder's line, provoked violent criticism from those in attendance. Most speakers rejected Foster's arguments and supported the, quote, new course of the CPUSA outlined by Browder. Speaking during the meeting against Browder, Darcy said that, in his opinion, Foster's speech was not aimed at diminishing Browder's authority. Like Foster, Darcy violently criticized the interpretation given by Browder of the Tehran decisions and asserted that the political agreement of the big three powers who constitute the Tehran Conference should not be considered as an agreement on the principal post-war economic problems. Afterwards, Darcy was expelled from the party by the Congress on the proposal of a commission named by the Central Committee and headed by Foster because, as the decision says, by sending to party members a letter containing slanderous declarations on party leaders, he attempted to create a fraction within the party, and because he submitted the letter in question to the bourgeois press. After the extraordinary session of the National Committee, a discussion on Browder's report to the plenary assembly of the Central Committee was opened in the basic organizations of the party, in regional congresses and the party press. According to information published in the Daily Worker, after the discussion, the organizations and regional congresses of the party unanimously accepted Browder's proposals. As to Foster, he declared at the extraordinary session of the National Committee that he did not intend to make known his differences with Browder outside the party Central Committee. The Congress of the CPUSA, the 12th National Convention held May 20, 1944, heard Browder's report in which he expressed his opinions regarding the political situation in the U.S., and he proposed the adoption of a new course in the policy of the Communists of the U.S. Proposing a resolution on the dissolution of the CPUSA, Browder declared, quote, on January 11, the National Committee of the Communist Party, in the interest of national unity and to enable the Communists to function most effectively in the changed political conditions and to make still greater contributions toward winning the war and securing a durable peace, recommended that the American Communists should renounce the aim of partisan advantage and the party form of organization, With that purpose, I propose in the name of the National Committee and in consultation with the most important delegations in this convention, the adoption of the following motion. I hereby move that the Communist Party of America be and hereby is dissolved, unquote. After having accepted the resolution on dissolution of the CP, the Congress of the CPUSA proclaimed itself the Constituent Congress of the Communist Political Association of the United States and adopted a programmatic introduction to the association's statutes. In this introduction, it is said, quote, "The Communist Political Association is a non-party organization of Americans which, basing itself upon the working class, carries forward the traditions of Washington, Jefferson, Paine, Jackson, and Lincoln under the changed conditions of modern industrial society." Okay. It seeks the effective application of democratic principles to the solution of the problems of today as an advanced sector of the democratic majority of the American people. It upholds the Declaration of Independence, the United States Constitution and its Bill of Rights, and the achievements of American democracy against all the enemies of popular liberties. It is shaped by the needs of the nation at war, being formed in the midst of the greatest struggle of all history. It recognizes that victory for the free peoples over fascism will open up new and more favorable conditions for progress. It looks to the family of free nationals, led by the great coalition of democratic capitalist and socialist states, to inaugurate an era of world peace, expanding production and economic well-being, and the liberation and equality of all peoples regardless of race, creed, or color. It adheres to the principles of scientific socialism, Marxism, the heritage of the best thought of humanity, and of 100 years' experience of the labor movement, principles which have proved to be indispensable to the national existence and independence of every nation. It looks forward to a future which, by democratic choice of the American people, our own country will solve the problems arising out of the contradiction between the social character of production and its private ownership, incorporating the lessons of the most fruitful achievements of all mankind in a form and manner consistent with American traditions and character, unquote. The Constituent Assembly of the CPA adopted a main political resolution, National Unity for Victory, Security, and a Durable Peace. The resolution points out the exceptional importance of the Tehran Conference decisions for victory over the aggressor and the establishment of a lasting peace. It calls for reinforcement of national unity as the necessary conditions for their application. By national unity is meant union of all patriotic forces from communists, laborites, to adherents of the Democratic and Republican parties. All ideological, religious, and political differences must be subordinated to this unity. The resolution stresses the exceptional importance of the 1944 elections on whose results depend the country's unity and destiny. It recognizes the increasingly important role of the working class in national unity, its growing activity, and its political influence. The resolution flays the reactionary policy of groups led by DuPont, Hearst, McCormick, characterizing this policy as pro-fascist and treason, and calling on the American people to struggle against these groups. The resolution then says that the majority of the American people are not yet convinced of the need for a more radical solution to social and economic problems with the aid of nationalization of big industry or by means of establishing socialism. That is why the immediate task consists in obtaining a higher level of production in the framework of the existing capitalist regime. With this, private employers must receive all possibilities to solve the problem of production and employment of labor. Solution of these problems is likewise, in the first place, linked to the maximum increase in the American people's purchasing power and extension of foreign commerce. If private industry cannot solve these tasks, the government must assume responsibility. The resolution expresses itself against anti-Semitism, anti-Negro discrimination, calls for the outlawing of the, quote, fifth column, and for the banning of calls by the latter for a negotiated peace with the aggressor. The resolution concludes, quote, "For the camp of national unity, which is composed of the patriotic forces of all classes, from the working people to the capitalists, rests and depends upon the working class, the backbone and driving force of the nation and its win-the-war coalition. It requires the extension of labor's united action of the AFL, the CIO, and railroad brotherhoods. It requires the most resolute development of labor's political initiative and influence, with labor's full and adequate participation in the government. We communists, as patriotic Americans, renew our pledge to the nation to subordinate everything, to win the war, and to destroy fascism," unquote. In addition to the resolution on national unity, the CPA Congress passed a series of other decisions on transition from war to peacetime production, on international trade union unity, on the CPA's wage policy, on political life as it regards demobilized veterans, on work among women, on farmers, on the situation in the southern states, on suppressing the poll tax, on the fight against anti-Semitism, on unity among countries of the Western Hemisphere, and on the 25th anniversary of the communist movement in the U.S. The Congress unanimously elected Browder president of the CPA. The CPA Congress addressed a message to Comrade Stalin and the Red Army, saying especially, quote, "In every American city and village, every factory and farm of our great land, men and women and children of all classes speak with wonder and deep gratitude of the heroic achievements of the Soviet Union and its valiant Red Army. Every day since the brutal and treacherous common fascist enemy violated your borders on June 22, 1941, more of the American people have come to know and love your leaders and your people. The political and military leadership of the USSR and its mighty Red Army is applauded not only by our great political and military leaders, but by our workers, farmers, businessmen, professional people, artists, scientists, and youth. The appeasers of the Hitlerites and the enemies of our common victory, who have been trying to frighten us with Hitler's Soviet bogey, have not succeeded in blinding our people to the realities. Your deeds daily speak with an authority that drowns their poisonous words. As the relentless offensives of your mighty forces drive the Nazis from your soil, bringing nearer the day of your common and final victory over the fascist enemy, we grow ever more conscious of our enormous debt to you, the leaders and fighters and peoples of the great Soviet land. The names of your liberated towns and villages are daily on our lips, the name of Stalin and the names of your countless heroes enshrined in our hearts. Daily, more and more of our people understand why it is that yours, the world's first socialist state, has given the world such an unparalleled example of unity, heroism, individual initiative, and a new discipline in the art and science of warfare. All patriotic Americans are determined to strengthen still further the concerted action of the United Nations and its leading coalition of our country, the Soviet Union, and England, on which our assurance of victory rests. They are determined to continue and deepen this coalition in the peace to come, and to extend the friendship among our peoples, which will cement the alliance of our two powerful nations as the mainstay of victory, national freedom, and an enduring peace." Unquote. After the Constituent Congress, the leadership of the CPA waged a campaign of explanation on the aims and tasks of the association. In one of his speeches, Browder said, quote, "That is why we dissolved the Communist Party, renounced all aims of partisan advancement, and regrouped ourselves into the nonpartisan Communist Political Association. That is why we are ready and willing to work with any and all Americans who place victory in the war as their first law, and who move towards such a minimum program as we have outlined for the solution of our post-war problems. This is why we do not associate ourselves with any other political party, but rather with the most forward-looking men in all parties." Unquote. It's quoting from The War and the Elections, June 18, 1944. Explaining the functions of the CPA, its organizational secretary, John Williamson, declared, quote, "As regards the functioning of the association, we emphasize that this means manifold increase and improvement in every aspect of political educational activity on a national, state, and local club basis. We must become known as an organization whose grasp of Marxism provides us with correct answers to the complex political problems confronting the people. While the members belong to and are active in every type of mass organization, political, economic, cultural, fraternal, etc., the association in its own name will speak out boldly and with initiative on all issues and policies." Unquote. The practical activity of the CPA since the Congress was subordinated to the principal task of the hour, active participation of the CPA in the 1944 election campaign. The National CPA Congress unanimously backed Mr. Roosevelt's presidential candidacy. In their speeches, Browder and the other leaders of the CPA, in the name of the CPA, supported Mr. Roosevelt's fourth term. The regional state organizations of the CPA and local clubs carried on an active propaganda campaign in favor of Mr. Roosevelt and congressional candidates favorable to Mr. Roosevelt. On September 25, 1944, during a meeting called by the New York CPA on the 25th anniversary of the communist movement in the U.S., Browder said, quote, "Every group, however small, just as every individual has the same supreme duty to make its complete and unconditional contribution to victory. We must give not only our lives, but we must be ready also to sacrifice our prejudices, our ideologies, and our special interests. We American communists have applied this rule, first of all, to ourselves. We know that Hitler and the Mikado calculated to split the United Nations on the issue of communism and anti-communism. We know that the enemy calculated to split America on this issue in the current elections, and thus prepare our country for withdrawal from the war and a compromised peace. We therefore set ourselves as our special supreme task to remove the communists and communism from this election campaign as in any way an issue, directly or indirectly. To this end, we unhesitatingly sacrificed our electoral rights in this campaign by refraining from putting forward our own candidates. We went to the length of dissolving the Communist Party itself for an indefinite period into the future. We declared our readiness to loyally support the existing system of private enterprise, which is accepted by the overwhelming majority of Americans, and to raise no proposals for any fundamental changes which could in any way endanger the national unity. We helped with all our strength to restrain all impulses towards strike movements among the workers, and to prepare the workers for a continuation of national unity after the war. As spokesman for American communists, I can say for our small group that we completely identify ourselves with our nation, its interests, and the majority of its people in this support for Roosevelt and Truman for president and vice president. We know quite well that the America that Roosevelt leads is a capitalist America, and that it is the mission of Roosevelt, among other things, to keep it so. We know that only great disasters for our country could change this perspective of our country from capitalism to that of socialism in the foreseeable future. Only failure to carry through the war to victory, or a botching of the peace and failure to organize it, or the plunging of our country into another economic catastrophe like that of the Hoover era, could turn the American people to socialism. We do not want disaster for America, even though it results in socialism. If we did, we would support Dewey and Hoover and Bricker and their company. We want victory in the war with the Axis powers and all their friends eliminated from the world. We want a world organized for generations of peace. We want our country's economy fully at work, supplying a greatly multiplied world market to heal the wounds of the world, a greatly expanded home market reflecting rising standards of living here, and an orderly, cooperative, and democratic working out of our domestic and class relationships, within a continuing national unity that will reduce and eventually eliminate large domestic struggles. That is why American communists, even as our great communist forebears in 1860 and 1864, before Capital was even written, supported Abraham Lincoln, will in 1944 support Franklin Delano Roosevelt for President of the United States, unquote. Comment, wow, that is like a textbook of revisionist positions. Continuing. As to Browder's attitude toward the Soviet Union, he highly appreciates the USSR's role in the United Nations system and in the work of finally crushing Hitlerite Germany and establishing a lasting peace after the war. Browder stressed more than once that the Soviet state built by Lenin and Stalin constitutes the irreplaceable force which saved the world from fascist slavery, and he called for it to be made known to all Americans the wisdom of Leninist-Stalinist theory that made the Soviet Union great and powerful. From an organizational point of view, the CPA structure is as follows. The basic organizational cell is the territorial club, whose general meeting is called once a month. Between general membership meetings, all the work planned by the club is carried out by its committee, made up of the most active members. The clubs are subordinated to regional CPA councils. The leading organization of the CPA is the National Committee, elected for 2 years at the Association Congress. The Association's president and 11 vice presidents elected by the Congress comprise the permanent leading organization of the Association. The CPA Congress set forth maintenance of the principle of democratic centralism as the structural basis of the association. Williamson, CPA Organizational Secretary, explained to the Congress in these terms the application of the democratic centralism principle of the CPA. Quote, while maintaining a structure and minimum organizational requirements compatible with the character of a Marxist political educational association, we must grant greater autonomy to the lower organizations, emphasize that democracy is a two-way street from top to bottom and bottom to top, and eliminate all rigidity of organization. Unquote. The National Congress of the Political Association adopted the CPA Constitution, in which it said that everyone who wishes to belong to the CPA accepts its program and its line. Explaining who can belong to the association, the Daily Worker wrote, quote, "We can ask of the new applicants to membership in the party only loyalty to the principles that are already comprehensive to all workers, devotion to the most basic duties of action today, plus a willingness and eagerness to study the program and history, and the theory which will make them thorough communists, and above all, a willingness to fight, to sacrifice in the war of mankind against Nazi enslavement is the first requirement for entering the Communist Party." Unquote. At the time of its dissolution, the Communist Party of the United States, according to Browder's declaration, had 80,000 members without counting the 10,000 party members in the army. According to the Congress decisions, all members of the CPUSA are members of the CPA and must register before July 4, 1944. As the Daily Worker announced, up to July 16, 1944, hardly 45,000 persons had been registered. Comment. So the earlier quote was from February 1944 when all of this was being proposed, hence the party still existed. Continuing. Without analyzing in detail Browder's full position on the dissolution of the CPUSA and the creation of the Communist Political Association, and without making a developed critique of this position, one can nevertheless deduce from it the following conclusions. 1. The course applied under Browder's leadership ended in practice in liquidation of the independent political party of the working class in the United States. 2. Despite declarations regarding recognition of the principles of Marxism, one is witnessing a notorious revision of Marxism on the part of Browder and his supporters, a revision which is expressed in the concept of a long-term class peace in the United States, of the possibility of the suppression of the class struggle in the post-war period, and of establishment of harmony between labor and capital. 3. By transforming the Tehran Declaration of the Allied Governments, which is a document of a diplomatic character, into a political platform of class peace in the United States in the post-war period, the American communists are deforming in a radical way the meaning of the Tehran Declaration and are sowing dangerous opportunist illusions which will exercise a negative influence on the American labor movement if they are not met with the necessary reply. 4. According to what is known up to now, the communist parties of most countries have not approved Browder's position, and several communist parties, for example that of the Union of South Africa and that of Australia, have come out openly against this position, while the communist parties of several South American countries, such as Cuba and Colombia, regarded the position of the American communists as correct and in general followed the same path. Such are the facts. Such are the elements of understanding which permit passing judgment on the dissolution of the American Communist Party. French communists will not fail to examine, in the light of Marxist-Leninist critique, the arguments developed to justify the dissolution of the American Communist Party. One can be sure that, like the communists of the Union of South Africa and of Australia, the French communists will not approve the policy followed by Browder, for it has swerved dangerously from the victorious Marxist-Leninist doctrine whose rigorously scientific application could lead to but one conclusion: not to dissolve the American Communist Party, but to work to strengthen it under the banner of stubborn struggle to defeat Hitler Germany and destroy everywhere the extensions of fascism. The fact that all the members of the Communist Party of the United States did not sign up automatically in the Communist Political Association, and commenting, in fact, from the numbers presented before, only about 45,000 or half out of 90,000 did, continuing, shows that the dissolution of the party provoked anxieties, perfectly legitimate. In the United States, the omnipotent trusts have been the object of violent criticism. It is known, for instance, that the former Vice President of the United States, Henry Wallace, has denounced their evil doings and their international policy. We too in France are resolute partisans of national unity, and we show that in our daily activity. But our anxiety for unity doesn't make us lose sight for a single moment of the necessity of arraying ourselves against the men of the trusts. So commenting, this is the same point that Foster brought up, which was the problematic position with regard to monopoly capital, or the big trusts. So I would say that while that is definitely the most glaring and absurd point in dire need of criticism, it's far from the end of the line. Anyway, continuing, furthermore, one can observe a certain confusion in Browder's declarations regarding the problem of nationalization of the monopolies and what he calls the transition from capitalism to socialism. Nationalization of monopolies actually in no sense constitutes a socialist achievement, contrary to what certain people would be inclined to believe. No, in nationalization, it is simply a matter of reforms of a democratic character, achievement of socialism being impossible to imagine without preliminary conquest of power. Everyone understands that the communists of the United States want to work to achieve unity in their country, but it is less understandable that they envisage the solution of the problem of national unity with the goodwill of the men of the trusts and under quasi-idyllic conditions as if the capitalist regime had been able to change its nature by some unknown miracle. In truth, nothing justifies the dissolution of the American Communist Party in our opinion. Browder's analysis of capitalism in the United States is not distinguished by a judicious application of Marxism-Leninism. The predictions regarding a sort of disappearance of class contradictions in the U.S. correspond in no wise to a Marxist-Leninist understanding of the situation. As to the argument consisting of a justification of the party's dissolution by the necessity of not taking direct part in the presidential elections, this does not withstand a serious examination. Nothing prevents a communist party from adapting its electoral tactics to the requirements of a given political situation. It is clear that American communists were right in supporting the candidacy of Roosevelt in the last elections, but it was not at all necessary for this to dissolve the Communist Party. It is beyond doubt that if, instead of dissolving the Communist Party of the United States, all had been done to intensify its activity in the sense of developing an ardent national and anti-fascist policy, it could very greatly have consolidated its position and considerably extended its political influence. On the contrary, formation of the Communist Political Association could not but trouble the minds and obscure the perspectives in the eyes of the working masses. In France, under cover of resistance unity, certain suggestions for the liquidation of the party have been circulated, with more or less discretion, during the last months, but none among us has ever thought of taking such suggestions seriously. It is not by liquidating the party that we would have served national unity. On the contrary, we are serving it by strengthening our party. And as far as the American communists are concerned, it is clear that their desire to serve the unity of their country and the cause of human progress places before them tasks which presuppose the existence of a powerful communist party. After the Tehran decisions came the Yalta decisions, which expressed the will of the Big Three to liquidate fascism in Germany and to help the liberated peoples to liquidate the remnants of fascism in the different countries. It is scarcely necessary to recall that the material bases for fascism reside in the trusts, and the great objective of this war, the annihilation of fascism, can only be obtained to the extent in which the forces of democracy and progress do not shut their eyes to the economic and political circumstances which engender fascism. The American communists have an especially important role to play in the struggle taking place between the progressive forces of the earth and fascist barbarism. Without any doubt, they would have been in a better position to play this role in the interests of their country and human progress if, instead of proceeding to dissolve their party, they had done everything to strengthen it and to make it one of the elements of the assembling of the broad democratic masses of the United States for the final crushing of fascism, that shame of the 20th century. It would be useless to hide the fact that fascism has more or less concealed sympathizers in the US, as it has in France and other countries. The former Vice President of the U.S., Henry Wallace, present Secretary of Commerce, said rightly that one cannot fight fascism abroad and tolerate at home the activity of powerful groups which intend to make peace, quote, with a simple breathing spell between the death of an old tyranny and the birth of a new, unquote. The Yalta decisions thwart these plans, but the enemies of liberty will not disarm of their free will. They will only retreat before the acting coalition of all the forces of democracy and progress. And it is clear that if Comrade Earl Browder had seen, as a Marxist-Leninist, this important aspect of the problems facing liberty-loving peoples in this moment in their history, he would have arrived at a conclusion quite other than the dissolution of the Communist Party of the United States. And that is the end of the audiobook. So again, for my part, I would say in summary that I think that this letter kind of barely scratches the surface, like it openly criticizes the dissolution of the party, as well as a couple of the most egregious revisionist positions, like that there will be a long-lasting class peace and that everything can be resolved within the framework of capitalism, etc., etc. But beyond that, I thought when we were doing our own reading of the Browder piece and I was supplying editorial comments, there was a lot really that required shredding, total skewering. I mean, leaving very little left. There were many assumptions that I think were left unchallenged, and that may have been in part an artifact or byproduct of the somewhat opportunist Popular Front theory that was being put forward under Dimitrov in the Comintern, and to some extent that may have been compromising the international communist movement as a whole, with all kinds of class collaboration policies being put forward for one reason or another, with varying levels of justifiability. To me, this is a watershed as far as the wheels really starting to come off of several decades of really incredible revolutionary momentum. Yes, we would continue to see revolutions, at least nominally, for some time, but the growth of revisionism and the kind of shaky basis of some of these, I think, would play out in a way that we would see implode by the end of the 20th century. So now we're in a position where a lot of this has to be more or less redone from scratch. And in the United States, at least, with a labor movement that is at its lowest point in terms of percentage of the workforce since the 1930s, since before the 1930s. So not great. And it's important, I think, as we continue this series and understanding how the CPUSA got, quote, repaired and put back into place, was that on a really strong basis, or was it still full of right deviations, as a lot of the critics suggest? Well, we will continue to explore that in the coming weeks as we continue to provide more installments from this reading list. In the meantime, what do you think? Leave a question or comment below, and we will continue the discussion there as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons and Buy Me a Coffee supporters whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen and help this channel keep making content in a non-commercial and sponsor-free way, head to patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. These videos take a lot of time to research, prepare, produce, and put online, then to moderate the comments and all that kind of stuff. So if you like this content, thank me, but also thank a patron or Buy Me a Coffee supporter, and please consider becoming one yourself. Beyond that, we can agitate and educate to a great extent online, but the third part of that formula, organizing, does take place in the real world, so get to know your local left. If you're in a city, there will probably be a number of different groups, some of them Marxist, many of them not, but get to know them, see what they do in practice, see how their meetings are, let them get to know you, network with people. You will find projects going on that maybe aren't openly advertised, but once you get to know people, they might bring you in on. And if you're not in the city, then you might want to think about joining something on a statewide or regional or even national basis. Do get involved to the extent that you can, because yes, we need to study the books, we need to study the history, but that process even is accelerated by getting to know these trends in person, in real life. You can see all of this acted out. It's going to make the history come to life when you read and study that. And conversely, you can actually take the history and theory that you've been studying and go out in the world. And unlike with history, which is set and fixed in the past, you can actually advocate for a Marxist course of direction on whatever question your left organization or organizations, coalition, Congress, whatever, is considering. All right, that's it for me. Thanks again, and we will see you in the next video.